Welcome everyone. I am Aldo Liga, Research Fellow at East Peace MENA Center, and I have the pleasure of moderating today this MED conversation in which we will discuss the first month of Donald Trump back in the White House and its impact in the Middle East. The aim today is to try to understand better what are the priorities of the new administration in the region and what is the impact at the diplomatic level, but also on the ground, of the first moves of the new president, namely the declarations on a possible American takeover of Gaza. We have all watched today the video of the Trump Gaza post on Truth Social, the plan for a relocation of Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan, the restoration of a maximum pressure campaign on the Iranian government, but also, and broadening the picture, what could be the potential impact of the freezing of foreign aid, development and humanitarian assistance in the region, and how the region's economy and energy sectors could be impacted by the president's announced economic policies and trade wars. So today we have the great opportunity to discuss these challenges with James Carafano, Senior Counselor to the President at the Heritage Foundation, with Lina Khatib, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and with Beth, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science International Affairs and former Director of the President's Daily Brief during the first term at the White House of President Trump. So thanks for being with us today and welcome again. Let's open our discussion. We will have around 40 minutes to debate all these questions. So I would start with the first question for James Carafano, beginning specifically with Trump's declarations on the future of Gaza, declarations which have sparked concerns among Palestinians, the Arab countries, but also in Europe and in the rest of the world. What do you think about this plan? Is this something feasible? And what is the rationale behind this proposal of the new president?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting the dialogue. I think it's an important topic and well worthy of an international discussion. We ought to start with what we know about Donald Trump's policy towards Gaza and the West Bank, and how that fits in with the continuity of how he saw the region in his first term as well. We know that the president is no fan of the two-state solution because he doesn't believe it'll lead to a future of peace and prosperity in the region. We know that the president has always prioritized at the top of his agenda normalization of relations between the Arabs and Israel for regional peace and prosperity and stability, and dealing with the threat of Iran. And he's refused, in a sense, to have everything in the region move at the pace of determining the future of the Palestinian territories. So we pick up from that, which is unchanged, with the president's obvious priority on seeing Iran as the major threat in the region, wanting to deal with that, being a huge fan of the Abraham Accords and wanting to get that back on path. And with the recent path. And I think the thing that we see there is that the president looks at what happened on October 7th, and he says that is absolutely unacceptable, that something like that could ever happen again. And I think primarily what he has put on the table is a marker saying, look, I don't know what the future of Gaza really looks like, but I can tell you one thing is we're not going back to the conditions that created the preamble to October 7th. We're not going to let NGOs and organizations go back in, rebuild the country, allow Hamas to reestablish a power base and become a military threat to Israel again. And I'm not sure how he feels deeply about his plan, but I think his is a signal that you're not just going to go back to business as usual, and put that out really as a challenge to the region, that if you don't like my plan, come up with a alternative which satisfies the minimums, which is we deal with the future security threats to the region. We come up with a solution that's practical, feasible, and acceptable, and acknowledge that that's going to fit in the context of his larger plans to restart the Abraham Accords. So I think that's where we are.
Thank you, James Carafano. So now move to Beth Sanner. We will expand a little bit this first question. Some observers have argued that the plans Trump announced for the future of the Gaza Strip are in reality more, let's say, negotiation gambits and tactics rather than something practical. So it's like if the president is adopting a sort of escalate to de-escalate approach. So what do you think about it? Is this approach something bound to be successful, or does it risk to be harmful for both the stability of the region, but also for American interests in the long term?
Well, thank you also for having me here and having me join with James and Lina. I really agree with what James laid out here in terms of how President Trump thinks about these things. I think I would not disagree with anything he said. Let me pick up from there and say that I guess, from my perspective, I kind of doubt that it was a negotiating ploy. I think that he actually really believes that this plan is a good idea, but that doesn't mean that it might not have this positive byproduct of stimulating the thoughts. So in some ways, maybe it, I don't know, he may think like, well, that doesn't really matter. My point is that it actually does matter. That he laid out something that is so contrary to the kind of belief sensibilities and historical context of the Middle East. And so that is kind of my primary concern. I recently wrote a piece called President Trump Says the Quiet Parts Out Loud. And he said some things that people are afraid to say and don't want to say in the region. He said that Gaza is a living hell for Gazans. He said that, as James said, if you do not remove Hamas, we're going to be in this Groundhog Day of more violence, rebuilding, more violence, and that does not make sense. And then the third part was the part that he refused to say out loud, which was the two-state solution, as James said. And I've tried to explain to people in some ways, like, you can understand how a real estate guy, or in fact, two real estate guys with Witkoff, how they would think that that actually makes sense. Because if I were living in that circumstance, I wouldn't want to be there. But the problem is that we are not Gazans. We do not have the history and the experiences of Gazans, Palestinians, Arabs. And if they had had that understanding when they put that out there, I don't think they would have tabled it, because it actually makes all of the longer term goals, their main goals, as James said, with Saudi normalization, actually harder in the near term. Right. So I just, Saudi normalization with Israel counted on two things for the last few years. One was the end of the war to Gaza, and the other was the security guarantees for Saudi Arabia. You've now basically put on the table an end of the war in Gaza that does not include the primary Saudi demand of it leading to some sort of pathway, something, right? By removing all Palestinians and doubling down on that, you've taken that off the table. And then with the security guarantees, the Saudi defense minister was in Washington this week, and he met with Hegseth. A person from the press said, blurted out to Hegseth, will Washington defend Saudi Arabia if attacked by Iran? And of course, Hegseth can't really answer that question. He said, well, this is one thing we're talking about. But my sense from that meeting, which was really designed, I think, this early reach out to say, hey, they said this was about the strategic partnership. This was to figure out whether the Biden plan on strategic partnership and guarantees was still on the table. My guess is it's not, because I don't believe that President Trump, for all of his true, absolute, heartfelt, he really likes Saudi Arabia. He really likes MBS personally, family connections, business connections, all of that. But I don't think that he will want to do security guarantees, and I don't think that they could get through Congress either. So President Trump's asking a lot of Saudi Arabia right now, and the world is different than when President Trump left. And I don't think that MBS is actually going to be able to concede on this point, which throws the entire game plan up in the air. And I think MBS right now is trying to become central to everything else that matters to the Trump administration, because he can't right now deliver on normalization.
Thank you, Beth. We will come back to this topic of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia later. But coming back to comments on Trump's declaration, on Gaza, these declarations and plans risk to further inflame the region in a phase that is not properly a peaceful phase, an easy phase. The situation is extremely delicate. There is an ongoing, very complex implementation of the ceasefire in Gaza, a risk of escalation in the West Bank, challenging political transition in Syria. The situation in Lebanon is not completely set. Let's say, redefinition of regional role of Iran will have implications for the whole area. So, Lina, Khatib, what do you think about that? About declarations of President Trump? Could this plan reduce the regional credibility of the United States in the area?
Well, the United States will always be the most influential actor internationally, not just in the Middle East. So no matter what comes out of the White House, that position is not likely to shift anytime soon. What Arab countries have been forced to do, especially those allied with where the US stands on Iran, and here I'm particularly talking about Arab countries that are US partners, these countries are concerned about their own public image. When statements from the White House go against what they have been publicly declaring commitment to. So, for example, with Saudi Arabia, when President Trump says that Palestinians could be moved outside Gaza, this directly contradicts the Saudi-endorsed Arab Peace Initiative, which has been on the table since 2002. And this remains the only Arab proposal for moving forward regarding the Israel-Palestine issue. So what they have to do is balance their treasured relationship with the United States, but at the same time maintain their own credibility in the Arab world, because Saudi Arabia, for example, is the leading Arab country. And so they have to, in a way, show that they have not given up on the peace process and the Arab Peace Initiative. But at the same time, you know, they don't want to ruin their relations with the US. So it's not the US that's losing credibility. It's statements like those on Gaza from President Trump recently that make things a bit challenging for the US's partners in the Arab world. However, we have to remember that President Trump has walked back on some of those comments already. So, for example, on this issue of removing Palestinians from Gaza, he actually said, and I quote, when he was talking about the rejection of Egypt and Jordan of this plan, he says, I was a little surprised that say that, but they did. And he said, the way to do it is my plan. I think that's the plan that really works, but I'm not forcing it. I'm just going to sit back and recommend it. So I'm quoting directly what he said. And so he is also acknowledging that he's not going to force any plan on the US's Arab partners, which is, you know, a very positive thing to say. And so I think eventually what we have is a big picture in which there are shared interests between the US and its partners in the region. Iran is a huge part of this story. Iran is also a shared threat between those countries and Israel. And so there's a lot more alignment than disagreement, the way I see it. And so I think we're just now, you know, going through a transitional phase But I think the fundamentals of the relationship between the US and the Arab world have not changed.
Thank you, Lina. So, James, as already said by both Lina and Beth, we have seen so far stronger and privileged relations between Trump and Mohammed bin Salman. We have the decision to host talks with Russia on Ukraine in Riyadh is quite significant. How do you see US-Saudi Arabia relations evolving during this mandate? And what about a possible deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, even if until some weeks ago Riyadh reiterated its stance against normalizing relations with Israel before the implementation of a two-state solution?
Thank you. Well, I think, again, certain things are very clear, and I agree with a lot of the comments. And I think the one thing that we absolutely all agree with is the worst thing you could do is to simplistically interpret Trump's actions as if he doesn't understand the region, doesn't know the players, doesn't know the stakes. He was president for 4 years. He dealt with these issues significantly. He's been on the stage for 8 years. He probably knows more world leaders than anybody else. His appointment of special envoys to the region is a top priority, indicates he takes it very seriously. So even though to some people say, well, that's not right, that doesn't sound right, this is obviously wrong, the presumption that Trump doesn't have great intentionality in these actions, I think would be wrong. I think as we've all noted, the Trump has consistently challenged the traditional way of thinking about things in the region, and he has done things provocatively, whether it's move the embassy, recognize Israel's territorial claims in the Golan Heights, or even with this proposal about Gaza. He has put things on the table to push the agenda to see, if where the real pressure points are. So clearly, if Trump is consistent with his actions in the past, he has a strategy which is really probing to see where are the real strength and weak points in his ability to push the agenda, which he's not going to alter from, which is to get back to the Abraham Accords and to deal with the Iranian security issue. I think the commonality of interest between the U.S. and its Arab partners in Israel is actually compellingly stronger than it was 4 years ago, that the need for a U.S. engagement in the region and the recognition that the United States is not going to step into the region in an overwhelmingly way, but it's going to be engaged in the region, and it's trying to construct an infrastructure where the region can really provide for the majority of its own stability with U.S. backing. That's unchanged, but the question is, how does that unfold? And I think it's just very unrealistic to say, well, here's the linear path that's going to follow. We have so many players who are not just the Arabs and Israel and the U.S. We have, what is Turkey going to do? What's the role of Russia going to be? How is China going to be handled? How does Iran respond to the number of setbacks that it's had? So I think it's unrealistic to look at a linear path. I think it's difficult to look at each little statement and negotiation and say, okay, here's what's going to happen, because everybody here kind of gets a vote. But I think we have to focus on what we know, which is the consistency of the president's objectives, his willingness to kind of test the geopolitical limits, the commitment of the United States that's not leaving the region, and I do think a certain amount of flexibility in the president, that it's the outcomes that I'm really focused on, not specific particular declarations or specific paths forward. That was a very unsatisfying answer, wasn't it?
Thank you, James. Beth Sanner, during the first term of President Trump between 2017 and 2021, the Palestinian cause was in some ways overlooked or neglected by the decision to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or to launch the process of normalization, which resulted in the Abraham Accords with some countries of the region. After the attacks of October 7 in 2023, what could be the implications of continuing to overlook and short-sighting the persistence of the Palestinian issue?
In some ways, I guess, although I'm thinking that I don't even know if that framing for me works. I do agree with James's point that there's so many players here. It's really hard to chart a linear path to really see where all this is going to go. But one thing that I am concerned about is that some of the Trump policies are on a collision course with some basic Arab needs. And so while I agree with Lina that the overall strategic relationship has not changed, and you do not see Arab countries coming out and criticizing their, putting on their big boy pants and trying to deal with things. But I do think when the Gaza plan was first initiated by Trump, my first reaction was that this was very good because it would stabilize the Netanyahu government and allow them to kind of push forward on phase 2. Steve Witkoff has reiterated comments about really wanting to move forward to phase 2. But that seems to be, we'll have to see. We'll have to see in the next week, because March 8th is, a decision point, and it could very well be that the Israelis are back at war. But what we have seen as a result of this is that the far right in Israel is now emboldened by this plan. And so, any talk about phase 2 is really becoming anathema. And what they keep saying out loud is, no, we need Trump's plan of completely moving all the Palestinians out of Gaza. And at the same time, President Trump said yesterday in the Oval Office, he hinted that, he said, when I demanded that all the hostages be released by 12 noon on Saturday, that's why Hamas was delivered. And then he said, and when they didn't get all of them out, I might have handled that differently, implying that he would have taken a much harsher hand, as he called it, all hell breaking loose against Hamas. So that also reinforces the far right perspective that going back to war, eradicating Hamas, which is a clear goal and has not been accomplished, made quite transparent by Hamas during all of these hostage exchanges. Hamas is basically setting themselves up by making it very, very clear that the goals have not been achieved, that they are still in power. And so all of this combines, to me, to be a resumption of the war, and the war with a new defense minister, a new chief of staff, and an emboldened far right. And at the same time, in the West Bank, we have this operation that's been going on for over a month. Real terrorists have been captured, real weapons. Iran is absolutely trying to stir the pot and push weapons into the West Bank and make it bad. But 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced, and the Minister of Defense has said that they will not come back for at least a year. And there is a settler convention going on. Ted Cruz is giving the opening prayer to this. The settlers have said 2025 is their year of annexation, and President Trump has promised something on this, saying that when asked about the West Bank annexation, that's going to work out very well, work out automatically. It's in good shape. We've discussed it. Other people have discussed it with us, with me. The West Bank is going to go out very well. and he has an ambassador who is very much in a pro-booster of the settlers. So the bombing that was diffused over the weekend, I think, is kind of, what is coming, more to come here, and that we will have a full-fledged intifada, although they're working hard to prevent that. And then we're going to have the Houthis, I think, unleash again. So Ramadan starts on Friday, but if we get to March 8th and there is not a continuation of phase 1, there are no negotiations on phase 2, and we may not get there. We may actually have something happen by March 8th. I hope so, because I'd like to see all the hostages out. That's a personal important for me. But if we don't, and there is a return to war, I think we'll have the Houthis at some point restarting, and I do not think you can bomb the Houthis out of existence.
Thank you, Beth. Lina, is this Trump's approach towards the Middle East bound to raise a new wave of resentment against the United States in the region? Could that be potentially an unintentional damage of Trump's policies?
I don't think so. It's just because the Middle East has seen other US presidents let it down in major ways, and the Trump presidency is only just beginning. So, 1 month after the presidency has started is too soon to kind of say the signs look really bad. I would say what caused a lot of resentment in the Middle East, frankly, was the presidency of Barack Obama. Before that, of course, George W. Bush, because of the invasion of Iraq, but even the Barack Obama era was marked by a lot of rhetoric that sounded great to a lot of people in the region, but action that was completely the opposite. And with President Biden, we also have to remember that there was no such flowery rhetoric, that people kind of found to be beneficial or positive, and no action either, frankly. So I think we have to qualify, where the Arab world stands and the Middle East at large regarding the experience with the United States. I think, if anything, frankly, the election of President Trump has brought a lot of hope in the region that things may actually be handled differently in Washington from how they were under Biden, because the Biden era, as I said, saw a lot of disappointment in the region regarding the US, for example, on Israel-Palestine, also on Syria, whereas now we are seeing these statements that may be rattling, but at the same time, the policy is still being formulated. So people have not given up on the US under Trump. So let's just kind of, take a moment to pause. One thing I will say is that actually the appetite for peace, if I can call it that, in the region is probably greater than ever. And another fundamental shift right now is that the position of Saudi Arabia in the region is also stronger than ever. And also, I will add, over the last 40 plus years, Iran now is also in the weakest position it's been in since the rise of the Islamic Republic. So there are some fundamental shifts in this region that a Trump presidency and a Trump administration can use very positively to shift the balance of power in the Middle East permanently. And I think what we're seeing now, as I said, it's a moment of transition, but what we're seeing is the birth of this new era in the region. People are tired of wars. People want to see stability. They want to have jobs and just live normal lives. And so, of course, this is not going to be something that will be achieved overnight, but there is wide recognition that the US is needed as part of this shift towards peace in the region. And that's why, there may be some pockets of resentment against the United States. Iran will continue to be a spoiler. And here I cannot stress enough how important it is for Washington now not to repeat the mistakes of the Barack Obama era in brokering deals with the current Iranian regime that only end up sustaining this a regime's destabilization role in the region. And so Iran is probably going to try to spoil, and the Houthis are definitely part of that. But the broader picture is one presenting many opportunities for strengthening relations between the United States and the Arab world, and working together towards peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. So James, trying to go deeper into the actors that will be involved into this process of meeting the appetite for peace of the region and the demands of peace from people of the region. So the actors involved into the shaping and unfolding of Trump's foreign policy in this second term. We know that there are different camps within the current administration. There are different ideologies, different approaches to diplomacy, different perceptions of security threats, and different power networks. So could you help us describing who they are and how are they positioned on the main questions related to the Middle East?
Yeah, I just don't think it's a relevant question, because the purpose of the president's cabinet and his officers is to reflect the great diversity of voices in America that felt that they needed representation in Washington, and he wanted to make sure that all those voices were recognized and heard. And it actually reflects the reality of the American conservative movement. There aren't orthodoxies on really anything. I would say the closest there is to a conservative orthodoxy in the United States, particularly when it comes to the Middle East, is there's a broad commitment to the U.S.-Israeli bilateral relationship. There's a broad, deep commitment across the conservative movement to combating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the United States and worldwide. But having said that, it doesn't matter, because the policies in the Middle East are very clearly driven by the president, and he's been very, very clear on those. And I think it's a mistake to look at different actors and to think that they're going to significantly deviate the president from his course. You know, I would say I think one of the problems with our conversation is I think we started in the wrong place. We started talking about Gaza as if this is the pacing item on U.S. policy in the Middle East or U.S. engagement in the Middle East, and it's not. Very clearly at the top of the president's list is dealing with Iran and eliminating Iran as a destabilizing threat to the region. Now, this regime the White House is not committed to regime change, but they are absolutely committed to eliminating Iran's meddling and destabilizing influence in the region, and its potential as a nuclear threat. Those things are I think, non-negotiable, and that's where the administration policy starts. Part of the reason why I'm more optimistic on the Saudi thing and the question of security commitments, not security commitments. In the end, what is the one thing that Saudi Arabia absolutely wants? It wants the Iranian threat to be eliminated or contained, and I think that's the one thing that they absolutely can count on the U.S. delivering on. I would say right below that, in addition to the U.S. ironclad commitment to the security of Israel, is this idea of the Abraham Accords and essentially the region going from a consumer of security and economic and geopolitical risk into a net provider of economic security, growth, growth and stability. And the president's committed to that. And the thing that I think is most interesting, and I'll just end on this, is the president's recent reaffirmation of the statement of the importance of the adding additional throughput through the region from India, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, through the Middle East to Europe. Sometimes it's called the IMEC corridor. But the president's reaffirmation the other day of a public statement saying India to Italy, the importance of this corridor, I think shows the grander vision of the president for the region and its importance as a connector and the reuniter of the traditional pathways bringing Eurasia together. And I think everybody acknowledges that there's no way that the Suez Canal can manage the capacity of growth and trade that we anticipate in the decades ahead. and the need for additional corridors is critically important, and how that really puts the Middle East back in the center of growth in Eurasia, and I think creates enormous economic and job growth potential. I think those are the things the president has his eye on, and I don't think there are factions within the U.S. government that are actually deeply inconsistent with that or going to deter him from that course.
Thank you, James. Carafano. Beth Sumner, expanding a little bit on what James just said, how does the new Trump's Middle East policy interact with the president's approach to other international players, China, Russia, India, and broadly on his vision of a new global order? And also, can you put that in relation with Iran, which has strong ties with both Russia and China?
So I guess one of my main things here is that it's very hard to make the connections in this really complicated world. And I think President Trump does understand these things, but he also is a negotiator that is very, very dogged in getting things done and getting very specific things done. And so he will be very, very focused on getting the Russia-Ukraine war stopped, getting the Gaza war stopped, even though, Iran is the big prize. We haven't heard that much on that point because it's only 30 days in. But he'll want to now turn also to China, and he'll want to go visit President Xi soon and really talk about what that relationship is going to be. And one of the issues I think that we all are waiting for is that we don't have a lot of clarity on what the U.S.-China relationship actually is going to be like. Unlike IMEC, which is a fairly easy, who would be against that? Close ties to India, understanding the connections there. Those are good, and I'm really glad to see those as early endorsements, just like I'm glad to see AUKUS as an early endorsement. But the China thing is still up in the air. We don't know. Are we going to be primarily in an adversarial mode? I think that President Trump would actually prefer to have a negotiation where the Chinese come to the table and are able to address some of the key issues that are of concern, particularly on the trade imbalance. But we have the fundamental issues of their military civilian structure and this competition and the threat that they pose. And I think it's going to be hard to square the circle on that. So China in the Middle East has been a big friction point during the first Trump administration. The President Trump was upset by and concerned by Chinese technology infiltration into UAE, Saudi Arabia, for example. And those things are probably going to still be a concern to him. But at the same time, I don't think the region wants to choose. So if we don't make them choose, then there's no issue. If we do make them choose, then I think things are going to become more complicated. But again, it's very early days, and we don't really know where the U.S.-China relationship is going to turn out. On Russia, the president has talked about Syria being an area where Russia and the United States could collaborate on. I don't agree with that. I hope that that is just a talking point, a sweetener, and that we understand that Syrians pushing Russia out of Syria is actually a great thing geopolitically. And on Iran, I actually believe that President Trump absolutely does not want to go to war with Iran, although he will if it is necessary. And to me, that is the right perspective. He wants a negotiation, and he doesn't have people from the previous administration who got in his way on that. And so I think that we will see in the coming months, again, we have to give them more than 30 days to figure all this out. But I think we'll see a negotiation. And I think that the Israelis, some of whom want to go right into taking down Iran militarily while they're weak, I don't think at this point that President Trump is in mind to do that, although perhaps he'll give the Israelis a green light to do that. We don't know yet, but I think right now he's actually much more oriented toward a negotiated solution and trying to take advantage of Iran's historic weaknesses.
Thank you, Beth. So to conclude this event with a final question for Lina Khatib, linking what seems to be the policy of President Trump towards the Middle East and European margins for action of both the European Union, but more broadly European actors, how the two approach could interact. And another question, if there is the possibility of some forms of convergence between EU governments and the British cabinet, like those we recently saw on Ukraine some days ago.
Thank you. I mean, I can tell you what I think they should do in terms of European countries, the EU, and my own country, the UK. I think there should be cooperation on Iran to take us away from this fixation with the nuclear deal, which has dominated the way Europeans and the UK included have been dealing with the Iran issue over, since the first presidency of Barack Obama, since 2008, because I think this has only brought further devastation and destabilization to the region. So I hope that they, for example, do list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, do go after the assets and financial operations of the IRGC and other Iran-backed actors in Europe, for example, and also take seriously the issue of Iran's destabilizing role in the Middle East. So on Iran, I hope there's greater alignment between Europe, the US, and crucially Gulf countries. I hope Europe and the UK continue to lift sanctions on Syria as a state, because the regime of Bashar al-Assad is gone, and Syria needs all the help it can get to have a successful transition, and that requires resources. So that's a key thing that needs to happen, in my view. Linked to this, coming together to also support stabilizing Lebanon. Because Lebanon, for example, right now needs to have the Lebanese armed forces deployed in areas that the army had not deployed to in the past because of Hezbollah's dominance. Now Hezbollah's dominance is significantly weakened. The army needs more soldiers, and it needs more resources as a result. And Lebanon obviously needs reconstruction, but that's something that has to come with very strict conditionality. And so there's an opportunity to reshape Lebanon in a positive way, so that Hezbollah is weakened for good and is no longer able to be a spoiler. So there are a number of things that the Europeans can do, which would be supportive of what Washington can put on the table. I don't think Europe is able, frankly, to sway Israel in any way. I think only Washington can actually influence Israel on the Israel-Palestine issue. I don't think Europe has given up on the two-state solution, and that is a good thing. No matter what is happening right now, I think ultimately Arab countries are firm in taking a stand to support this as the way forward. And so perhaps, in Israel, there could be a new administration at some point, and this might result in a change in the way Washington starts steering things in that regard, and then Europe can play a supporting role. So these are just some of the things that I want to put on the table for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Lina. So a lot of very interesting and regional points have been raised up. Thank again to our guests for this very interesting conversation. Thanks to James Carafano, Beth and Lina Khatib. Thanks to the audience, and see you soon.